You wake up. No alarm, no boss, no inbox. Sun is barely up. Birds are loud. You are already outside. There is no shift to clock into. No meeting at 9. Here's the thing nobody tells you. Ancient humans worked less than you do right now. A lot less. Hunter-gatherers spent maybe 15 hours a week finding food. The rest of the day is gone, unaccounted for, missing from every history book. Not to laziness, to something we forgot completely. Sit with that number for a second. 15 hours. That's not a typo, and it's not a myth someone invented to sell you a wellness retreat. 15 hours a week, spent doing the single most important task a human being has, feeding themselves and their family. You spend more time than that scrolling. You spend more time than that commuting to a job you complain about on the drive home. And somehow, tens of thousands of years ago, with none of our tools, none of our medicine, none of our supply chains, people were doing it faster than we do. So where did the rest of the week go? That's the part nobody explains. 168 hours in a week. Subtract 15 for food. Subtract sleep, maybe 56 hours if they were generous with themselves.
That still leaves almost 100 hours completely unaccounted for. 100 hours of a human life, every single week, with no record, no explanation, no box to check. We have entire museums dedicated to ancient tools. We have almost nothing dedicated to ancient boredom, ancient rest, ancient conversation. It's like finding a diary with every page blank except one, and assuming the blank pages didn't matter. They mattered. We just stopped asking about them. Here's where it gets interesting. In 1966, an anthropologist named Marshall Sahlins stood up at a symposium in Chicago and said something that made half the room uncomfortable. He said hunter-gatherers weren't living in poverty. He said they were, by a strange definition of the word, affluent. Not because they had more stuff, they had almost none. A digging stick, a few tools, maybe a fire. Sahlins' point was sharper than that, and stranger. Affluence, he argued, isn't about how much you have. It's about the gap between what you want and what you've got. Close that gap, and you're rich, even with nothing. Widen it, and you're poor, even with everything. Think about that for a second, because it's the kind of idea that reframes your entire week. You are, statistically, one of the wealthiest humans to ever live. More food available to you right now than any hunter-gatherer could imagine. More entertainment in your pocket than entire ancient societies. And you are, very possibly, more anxious about money than they ever were. Not because you have less, because your wants keep sprinting ahead of your resources, like a dog chasing its own shadow. Sahlins called this the Zen Road to affluence. Want little, and you already have enough. Compare that to what he called the Galbraithian Road, the one we're on, where you produce more and more, and somehow still never catch up.
That's the reframe. But it's not the whole story, because a theory from a conference room in 1966 means nothing without someone actually going out and checking. So, someone did. His name was Richard Lee, and in the 1960s he spent months living among the Hwansi, often called the Kwang, in the Kalahari Desert of southern Africa. Not a lush jungle, not a river delta, a desert. If the original Affluent Society idea was going to survive anywhere, you'd think it would collapse in a place this harsh. Instead, Lee found the opposite. He tracked how the Hwansi actually spent their time, hour by hour, day by day. Adults, he found, worked around 2 to 3 days a week gathering and hunting food, averaging out to roughly 20 hours, sometimes less. Even accounting for the time spent making tools and preparing food, the total came in well under what a modern full-time job demands. In one of the least forgiving environments on Earth, with none of our technology, people were feeding themselves and still had most of the week left over. Now, here's the wild part. What were they doing with it? Lee's notes and the fieldwork of anthropologists who followed him painted a picture that looks almost nothing like our idea of primitive survival. People rested. A lot. Long stretches of the afternoon spent doing what looks, from the outside, like absolutely nothing. Lying in the shade, half asleep, half talking. People visited other camps, sometimes walking for hours just to sit with relatives and gossip. People made things. Beads, arrows, jewelry, tools. Not always because they were needed immediately, but because making things filled the hands and passed the time. And people talked.
constantly.
Anthropologist Polly Wiesner, decades later, actually recorded and analyzed Jew-Hwanzi conversations by firelight versus conversations during the day. During the day, talk was practical. Complaints, gossip, negotiation, the business of living together. But at night, around the fire, something shifted. The talk turned to stories, myths, jokes, accounts of distant relatives, distant events, distant places. Wiesner found that firelight conversation activated something almost like a different social mode, less about logistics, more about imagination, connection, culture building. The campfire wasn't just where people gathered after work. The campfire was arguably the actual work, the work of being human together. There's another piece of this that almost never makes it into the popular version of the story, and it might be the most important piece of all: how egalitarian a lot of these societies actually were, and how deliberately that equality was maintained. Anthropologists who lived alongside groups like the Jew-Hwanzi noticed something strange happening whenever a hunter came back with an unusually large kill. You'd expect praise. Instead, the other hunters would mock it, downplay it, call the meat scrawny, the hunt lucky, the effort barely worth mentioning. Anthropologists eventually understood this wasn't rudeness, it was maintenance. It was a deliberate social mechanism to stop any one person from accumulating status and therefore power over the group. Sociologists later called this insurance against dominance, a kind of built-in leveling system running constantly so that no single ego could grow large enough to start bossing everyone else around. Compare that to almost every large-scale society that came after it, where status and hierarchy became the default operating condition instead of the thing actively being prevented. It's a small detail, but it says something enormous. Those long, unstructured hours weren't just personal downtime.
They were partly spent on the ongoing, unglamorous work of keeping the group itself flat, fair, and functional. A kind of social maintenance we don't really have an equivalent word for anymore because we stopped needing to do it on purpose. Let's pause and go back to that image from the start. You, waking up, no alarm, no boss. Birds loud, sun barely up. Now picture the rest of that day the way Lee and Wessner actually documented it. A few hours gathering or tracking, done by midday. Then nothing urgent. Shade, talk, a nap maybe. Someone repairing a tool they didn't strictly need yet. Kids running around underfoot, half supervised by whoever happened to be nearby. Because childcare wasn't one person's job, it was everyone's background task. And then as the light goes gold and the fire gets lit, the day shifts gear entirely. Stories, laughter, the kind of talk that has no deadline and no destination. That's not what you picture when someone says caveman, is it? We've been sold an image, grunting, struggling, barely surviving, one bad hunt away from starvation. And it turns out that image says a lot more about us than it does about them. It's basically an evolutionary horror movie we wrote about our own ancestors, and then forgot we were the ones holding the pen. But here's the problem. We can't just take this and run with it uncritically, because the story is more complicated than ancient people had it easy. And the honest version of this video has to slow down here. The first complication came from inside anthropology itself. Researchers pointed out that the original time use studies, the ones Sahlins leaned on, often counted only the time spent actively hunting or gathering.
What they didn't always count, especially in early studies, was food processing, cracking nuts, pounding roots, preparing meat, carrying water, sometimes for miles. A lot of that labor, in many hunter-gatherer societies, fell disproportionately on women, and it was frequently left out of the 15 hours figure entirely. When later researchers went back and counted processing time properly, the total work hours crept up, not to modern full-time levels, but meaningfully higher than the original headline number. So the 15-hour figure, the one that sounds so clean in a video hook, is a little too clean. It's real, it's documented, but it's also a floor, not the whole picture. The second complication is that hunter-gatherer is not one lifestyle. It's a category covering hundreds of different societies across radically different environments, and lumping them together is like describing modern jobs using only accountants as your example. The Jew-Hwanzi in a resource-scarce desert lived differently than groups on the resource-rich Pacific Northwest coast, where salmon runs were so abundant that some hunter-gatherer societies built permanent villages and complex social hierarchies, something we usually associate with agriculture, not foraging.
Arctic hunter-gatherers, hunting large, dangerous seasonal game, had punishing periods of intense, risky labor, followed by long stretches of enforced downtime, not because they chose leisure, but because there was nothing to hunt. So the honest answer, the one a lot of pop science versions of this topic skip over, is that we don't know exactly what the average ancient human did with their time, because there wasn't an average. There were 1,000 different versions of this life, shaped by coastline, climate, and what happened to be nearby to eat.
What we can say, carefully, is that across a huge range of documented hunter-gatherer societies, from the Kalahari to the Amazon to Aboriginal Australia, the pattern of moderate work hours plus substantial unstructured time shows up again and again. Not universally, not without exceptions, but often enough that it isn't a fluke, and often enough that Sahlins' original uncomfortable point still stands. These were not societies clawing at the edge of starvation every single day. Many of them had more slack in the system than we assume, and some had more slack than we do. So if that's true, if this pattern was real for most of human history, here's the actual mystery. What broke it? This is where the story takes its sharpest turn, and it's the part that should genuinely bother you, because the answer isn't modern technology fixed everything. The answer is closer to the opposite. Around 10 to 12,000 years ago, in various places around the world, humans started farming. We tend to teach this as an unambiguous upgrade, humanity leveling up, trading the uncertainty of foraging for the stability of agriculture. That's the story on the poster. It's not the story in the bones. Bioarchaeologists, researchers who study skeletal remains for evidence of how people actually lived, have found that early farming populations were frequently shorter, more malnourished, and more disease-ridden than the foraging populations that came before them. Living close to domesticated animals introduced new diseases we'd never been exposed to. Relying heavily on a small number of crops made diets less varied and nutrition worse, not better. Storing surplus grain created something foragers rarely had to deal with at scale: stuff worth stealing, which meant walls, which meant hierarchy, which meant some people telling other people what to do with their day. And the labor itself, clearing land, plowing, planting, weeding, harvesting, storing, defending the harvest, was relentless in a way that seasonal foraging simply wasn't. Jared Diamond, in a widely read and admittedly still debated essay, went so far as to call agriculture the worst mistake in the history of the human race.
That's a strong claim, and plenty of researchers push back on how absolute it is. Agriculture also enabled larger populations, cities, writing, medicine, everything that followed. But the specific claim that agricultural life meant harder, longer, more constant labor than the foraging life it replaced, that part holds up remarkably well across the archaeological record. So the trade wasn't leisure for stability. In a lot of ways, it was leisure for scale. We didn't get more free time as civilization advanced. We got more people, more stuff, more permanence, and we paid for it in hours. The skeletons make the case better than any essay could. Bioarchaeological studies comparing pre-agricultural and post-agricultural remains in the same regions have found measurable drops in average height after farming took hold, a strong signal of chronic nutritional stress, since height is one of the more reliable markers researchers use to reconstruct childhood health from bone alone. Dental evidence tells a simpler story. More cavities, more enamel defects, more signs of periods of starvation stamped directly into the teeth of early farmers compared to the foragers who came before them in the very same landscapes. Think about how strange that is. The advance that we teach as a straightforward improvement left a physical scar on the bodies of the people who lived through it, visible today, thousands of years later, to anyone who knows where to look on a skeleton. And the hours kept climbing. Fast forward to the Industrial Revolution, and things get worse before they get better. Factory workers in 19th century Britain and America were regularly clocking 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days, 6 days a week, well over 80 hours in a single week, more than 5 times what Richard Lee documented in the Kalahari.
It took over a century of labor movements, strikes, and legislation to claw that number back down to the 40-hour week most of us think of as normal today. So when you compare yourself to a hunter-gatherer, you're not comparing yourself to some fictional easy past. You're comparing yourself to a genuine data point from roughly the same species, doing the same fundamental task, staying alive, with radically less time spent doing it. Here's the reframe then. Here's the thing we forgot completely. We tend to think of leisure as a reward, something you earn after the work is done.
something civilization gradually granted us as a gift in exchange for our labor and loyalty. But that gets the order backwards. For the vast majority of human history, roughly 95% of the time our species has existed, unstructured time wasn't the reward for surviving. It was the baseline. It was simply what a human life looked like by default, most days in most places. Work was the interruption. Rest, talk, story, and play were the default setting we were built for, evolutionarily and psychologically, long before anyone invented the idea of clocking in. Think of your body like a machine that was engineered for a specific duty cycle, like an old solar panel, built to soak up a certain number of hours of light and then go dormant. We didn't evolve for 8+ hours of continuous, structured, high-focus output a day, 5 or 6 days a week for 50 years straight. Nothing in our evolutionary design anticipated that schedule. It's not that we're lazy or broken when a normal work week exhausts us. It's that we're running hardware built for 15 hours of productive labor a week and asking it to run 40, 50, sometimes 60. Of course the fan is loud. Of course it overheats. And this is the part that should genuinely unsettle you a little. That missing time from the start of this video, the 100 hours a week nobody talks about, it wasn't wasted.
It wasn't wandering aimlessly through the void, wasted, purposeless, waiting for civilization to fill it with something useful. It was doing something we've almost entirely lost the language for. It was maintaining the actual social fabric of the group. The gossip, the joking, the storytelling by firelight, the long naps, the pointless-seeming conversations. That wasn't the absence of culture. That was culture. That was the operating system running underneath everything else, the thing that kept small groups of humans bonded, informed, entertained, and sane enough to keep surviving together for another 100,000 years. We didn't get culture as a byproduct of free time. Free time was the delivery mechanism for culture, every single day on a loop. We built entire civilizations, split the atom, mapped the human genome, put cameras on Mars, and somewhere in that 4,000-year sprint, we quietly lost the plot on the one thing our species had already figured out at the very beginning. Rest isn't the leftover. Rest is the point the leftovers were built to protect. So go back to that morning. No alarm, no boss, sun barely up, birds loud, you're already outside. It used to feel, at the start of this video, like the opening of a story about hardship, a life with none of our comforts, none of our conveniences. Look at it again now. It isn't the opening of a hardship story at all. It's the opening of an ordinary Tuesday, a morning with no meeting at 9, because there was never supposed to be one. Not because ancient life was easy. It wasn't, and pretending otherwise does it a disservice too. But because somewhere in that unclocked morning, in the hours we never bothered to write down, humans were doing the only thing that ever actually made a life worth living in the first place. We didn't invent free time. We just forgot we used to have it and spent 10,000 years trying to earn back something that was never supposed to be a prize.